They called it the cruelest wedding Montana had ever seen, a decorated war hero shackled to the woman every man in town had rejected. When Luke McAllister stood at that makeshift altar in the Silver Spur Saloon, the laughter cut deeper than any Confederate bayonet ever had. But Mara Langley didn't flinch. She met his eyes with a fire that would either consume them both or forge something unbreakable. One dance. That's all it took to silence an entire town. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Montana Territory stretched vast and unforgiving in the summer of 1886, a land where men were measured by the calluses on their hands and the straightness of their word. Cottonwood Springs sat nestled in a valley where the mountains broke the horizon like jagged teeth, and the Big Timber River ran cold enough to steal your breath even in August. It was a town built on sweat and stubbornness, where the saloon did better business than the church, and every man carried a story he'd rather forget. Luke McAllister had more stories than most, though he kept them locked behind gray eyes that had seen too much for a man of 28. He'd come back from the war between the states with a limp he barely acknowledged, and scars that ran deeper than the puckered tissue across his shoulder blade. The Battle of Cold Harbor had taken his younger brother, his faith in God's mercy, and whatever softness he'd once possessed. What remained was a man who worked harder than any 3 ranch hands, spoke only when necessary, and never, not once in the 4 years since his return, had been seen courting a woman. He worked as foreman at the Triple Bar Ranch, managing 200 head of cattle and a rotating crew of drifters who respected him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Luke was first in the saddle before dawn and last to unsaddle at dusk. The owner, Thomas Garrett, trusted him with everything: the books, the breeding decisions, the hiring and firing. "You've got an honest soul, Luke," Garrett had told him once. "That's rarer than gold in this country." Honest, maybe. But honest men still carried debts. Luke's father, Samuel McAllister, had been a different sort of man entirely. A gambler who'd believed his luck would turn right up until the moment Doc Morrison pronounced him dead from a heart that finally quit on him. That had been 3 months ago, and with Samuel's passing came the revelation of debts scattered across Cottonwood Springs like buckshot. The biggest one, stamped and witnessed by the town magistrate, belonged to Hugh Langley, the blacksmith whose forge sat at the east end of Main Street, sending up sparks and smoke from dawn until long after decent folks had gone to bed. $500. That's what Samuel had borrowed 2 years back, promising to repay it within 6 months. The paper was legitimate, the signature unmistakable. Luke had stared at that promissory note in Magistrate Crawford's office, feeling the walls close in around him. "Your father's debts are your debts now," Crawford had said, not unkindly. The magistrate was a fair man, but the law was the law. Hugh's been patient, but patience doesn't feed a man or keep his business running. Luke had visited the forge the next day, hat in hand, prepared to negotiate terms. He'd expected Hugh Langley to be angry, demanding. Instead, he'd found a tired man in his late 50s, hair gone white from the heat of his work, hands scarred by 1,000 burns. "I don't have $500, Luke had said plainly, "but I'm good for it. Give me time, and I'll pay every cent." Hugh had set down his hammer, studying Luke with eyes that held something Luke couldn't quite name. "I know you're good for it, son. You're not your father. Everyone in town knows that." He'd paused, wiping soot from his face with a rag that only spread it around. "But I'm not getting any younger, and my girl, well, my girl needs securing." That's when Luke had first heard the proposal that would change everything. Mara Langley was 24 years old, and by Cottonwood Springs standards, hopelessly unmarriageable. It wasn't that she was ugly, though the town gossip certainly claimed as much. It was that she was different in ways that made men uncomfortable and women suspicious. She stood tall, near 5'9", with shoulders broadened by years of working alongside her father at the forge. Her hands were strong, her arms ropey with muscle. She wore men's work shirts more often than dresses, and her dark hair was usually pulled back in a practical braid that did nothing to soften the angles of her face. But it was her manner more than her appearance that had earned her reputation. Mara Langley didn't simper or blush. She didn't giggle behind her hand or lower her eyes when men spoke to her. She looked you straight in the face and spoke her mind, whether you wanted to hear it or not. She'd thrown a punch at Jacob Stern when he'd gotten too familiar at last year's barn dance, breaking his nose and her own knuckles in the process. She'd shouted down Reverend Paulson in the middle of Sunday service when he'd called her mother, dead 10 years now, a woman of loose morals. "My girl's got a temper like a forge fire," Hugh had said, and there'd been pride in his voice, even as he acknowledged what everyone else called a flaw. "She's scared off every man who's come calling. The last one ran off to Helena rather than face another Sunday dinner with her." Luke had listened, feeling the trap closing around him even as he understood the cruel logic of it. "I'm asking you to marry her," Hugh had said simply. "You do that, and we'll call the debt settled. You'll have a wife, I'll have peace of mind knowing she's provided for when I'm gone, and you'll be free of what your father left you." It was, Luke had realized, a business transaction, no different than buying cattle or selling horses, except the commodity in question was a woman's entire life. "And what does Mara say about this?" Luke had asked. Hugh had smiled grimly. "She says a marriage built on debt is no worse than a marriage built on lies. She's a practical girl. She knows what she is in this town's eyes." Luke had taken 2 days to think about it, 2 days during which he'd lain awake in the small foreman's cabin at the Triple Bar, staring at the ceiling and wondering if there was any other way. He could leave, head to California or Texas, start over somewhere his father's debts couldn't follow. But that would mean abandoning everything he'd built here, and Luke McAllister didn't run from obligations, no matter how much they cost him. On the 3rd day, he'd gone back to the forge and told Hugh Langley he'd do it. The wedding was set for Saturday, June 12th, a week that gave Luke barely enough time to comprehend what he'd agreed to. He'd seen Mara only twice in those 7 days. Once when she'd come to return a set of horseshoes her father had finished, and once at the general store where she'd been buying flour and salt. Both times she'd nodded at him, her expression unreadable, and both times he'd felt like he was looking at a stranger he was about to bind himself to for life. "You're making a mistake," Thomas Garrett had told him when Luke had asked for the day off. "That Langley girl's got a reputation, Luke. She's not a proper woman." Luke had thanked him for the concern and taken the day anyway. The ceremony was held at the Silver Spur Saloon because Reverend Paulson had refused to perform the service in the church, something about the unseemly nature of a transactional marriage and the sanctity of the Lord's house. So they'd gathered in the saloon on a Saturday afternoon, with the bartender serving as witness and half the town packed inside to watch what everyone was calling the saddest wedding Cottonwood Springs had ever seen. Luke had worn his one good suit, brushed and pressed, his hair slicked back with water that had already started to dry in the June heat. He'd stood at the front of the saloon, near the upright piano that Sarah Jenkins played on Saturday nights, and waited as the magistrate shuffled his papers. The crowd had been larger than he'd expected. Seemed like half the town had nothing better to do than watch a man marry himself into what they all considered a life sentence. He'd recognized most of the faces: ranch hands from the Triple Bar, shopkeepers from Main Street, housewives who'd probably told their husbands they needed to see this spectacle firsthand. And then Mara had walked in. She'd worn a dress. That alone had caused a ripple of surprise through the crowd. It was simple, made of blue calico with tiny white flowers, the kind of dress a dozen other women in town might own. But on Mara, it looked different somehow. She'd left her hair down, dark and thick, falling past her shoulders in a way Luke had never seen. She'd walked with her father, her back straight and her chin up, and if she'd heard the snickers and whispers that followed her progress through the saloon, she'd given no sign of it. "Well, I'll be," someone had muttered behind Luke. "She almost looks like a woman." "Still built like a ranch hand, though," another voice had replied, and laughter had rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. Luke had felt heat rise in his chest, anger on behalf of a woman he barely knew, which seemed absurd given the circumstances. But there was something about the way she'd held herself, the way she'd refused to let the mockery touch her, that had struck something inside him. She'd reached the front of the saloon and Hugh had placed her hand in Luke's. Her palm had been calloused, rough from work, and bigger than most women's hands. But it had been warm, and it hadn't trembled. Magistrate Crawford had cleared his throat and begun the ceremony, reading from a small book with pages so worn the corners had gone soft. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." The words had washed over Luke like river water, familiar phrases about love and honor and cherishing that seemed almost obscene given the reality of what was happening. This wasn't love. This was a debt being settled, two people being yoked together by circumstance and obligation. Do you, Luke James McAllister, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Luke had looked at Mara then, really looked at her for the first time. Her eyes were brown, he'd noticed. Not black, like he'd thought. Brown with flecks of gold, and they'd been watching him with an intensity that had made him wonder what she was thinking, what she was feeling about being bartered like a piece of property. I do, he'd said, and his voice had been steady even if his heart hadn't been. And do you, Mara Catherine Langley, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? She hadn't hesitated. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the Montana Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Crawford had smiled, the expression of a man relieved to have an awkward duty finished. You may kiss your bride. And that's when Luke had hesitated. It had only been a moment, barely a heartbeat, but in that small saloon packed with witnesses, it had been enough. He'd heard the intake of breath, the shuffle of feet, the beginning of laughter that people had tried to hide behind their hands. Mara had noticed too. Something had flickered across her face. Hurt, maybe, or resignation. And then she'd lifted her chin even higher. Before the laughter could fully take hold, she'd stepped closer to him and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "They can laugh. I'm not marrying them." And then she'd kissed him. It had been brief, chaste, barely more than a brush of lips. But it had been deliberate, chosen, and it had silenced every snicker in that room. When she'd pulled back, her eyes had held his for just a moment, and Luke had seen something there that made him ashamed of his hesitation, a kind of fierce pride that refused to be diminished by anyone's pity or scorn. "Congratulations," Magistrate Crawford had said, sounding relieved. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Luke McAllister." There had been polite applause, scattered and half-hearted, and then someone had called for drinks, and the crowd had begun to disperse, already moving on to the next entertainment, the next topic of gossip. Hugh had embraced his daughter, whispering something in her ear that Luke hadn't heard. Then the old blacksmith had shaken Luke's hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "Take care of her," he'd said. "She's worth more than this town's ever known." Luke had nodded, not trusting himself to speak. And just like that, it had been done. He was married to a woman he didn't know, bound by obligation and a dead man's debt, and the whole town was already talking about poor Luke McAllister, who'd gotten himself tied to the Langley girl. They'd left the saloon together, walking through the late afternoon sunlight toward the wagon Luke had borrowed. The town had watched them go. He'd felt the eyes following them, heard the renewed buzz of conversation the moment they'd turned the corner. "Where are we going?" Mara had asked. Her voice had been lower than he'd expected, rough around the edges like she didn't use it often. "The Triple Bar. I've got the foreman's cabin there. It's small, but it's—" He'd trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. Clean, adequate, better than nothing? "It'll be fine," she'd said, and that had been the end of the conversation. The ride out to the Triple Bar Ranch had taken 40 minutes, the wagon creaking along the rutted road that followed the river. They'd sat side by side on the bench seat, not touching, not speaking. The silence had been thick and uncomfortable, filled with all the things neither of them knew how to say. Luke had tried to think of something to break the quiet, some pleasantry or observation about the weather, but everything that came to mind had felt inadequate or false. "What did you say to a woman you'd just married out of obligation? Thank you for settling my father's debt? Sorry your life has come to this?" The cabin had come into view as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It sat about a quarter-mile from the main ranch house, a modest structure made of logs and chinked with mud, with a small barn and corral attached. Luke had built the corral himself his first year at the Triple Bar, working evenings and Sundays to create something that was his, some small claim of ownership in a world where he possessed so little. He'd pulled the wagon up to the cabin and set the brake, then climbed down and came around to help Mara descend. She'd accepted his hand, obligation, not need, and stepped down with the careful balance of someone used to managing her own way. "This is it," Luke had said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Like I said, It's small. Mara had surveyed the property with an appraising eye, taking in the neat stacks of firewood, the well-maintained fencing, the small garden plot where Luke had been growing vegetables. "You keep things orderly," she'd observed. "Habit from the army, I suppose." She'd nodded, and they'd stood there for another awkward moment before Luke had finally forced himself to move. "I'll show you inside." The cabin was single room, about 16 feet square, with a stone fireplace on one wall, a cook stove in the corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a bed that suddenly seemed both too large and too small for what it represented. Luke had cleaned that morning, sweeping the floor and changing the sheets, trying to make the space somehow more presentable for a wife he'd never courted. Mara had stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. She'd walked slowly around the perimeter, taking inventory of the space that was now hers. She'd touched the back of one of the chairs, tested the stability of the table, examined the few dishes stacked on the shelf beside the stove. "Where should I put my things?" she'd asked finally. Luke had realized with a start that she'd brought nothing with her. No trunk, no bag, no bundle of possessions. She'd come to him with literally just the dress on her back. Do you need to go back for your belongings?" "I'll fetch them tomorrow," she'd said. Didn't see the point in bringing them to the ceremony. Practical. That's what her father had called her, and Luke was beginning to understand what he'd meant. Mara Langley, Mara McAllister now, he had to remind himself, approached life with the same straightforward efficiency she'd probably use at the forge. No sentiment, no illusions, just the simple recognition of what needed to be done. "You can use those pegs there for hanging clothes," Luke had said, pointing to the wall beside the door where he'd hammered in several wooden pegs. "And that trunk at the foot of the bed, there's space in there." "And where will you be sleeping?" she'd asked. The question had hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and unspoken expectations. Luke had felt heat creep up his neck, embarrassed by his own embarrassment. He was a grown man, a war veteran, and yet the thought of sharing a bed with this stranger, his wife, he'd had to keep reminding himself, made him feel like an awkward boy. "I'll take the floor," he'd said finally. Until we figure things out." Mara had looked at him for a long moment, and he'd seen something flash across her face. Relief, maybe, or disappointment, or some combination of both. "That's a foolish waste of a bed," she'd said, "but it's your choice." She'd turned away then, moving to the window that looked out toward the mountains, and Luke had recognized the dismissal for what it was. The conversation was over. That first evening had been an exercise in careful choreography, 2 people navigating around each other in a space too small for the distance they were trying to maintain. Luke had gone out to tend to his horse and check on the cattle in the near pasture, giving Mara time alone in the cabin. When he'd returned, she'd had a fire going in the stove and was examining his meager food supplies with a critical eye. "You've got beans and bacon and not much else," she'd observed. "I usually eat up at the main house with the other hands." "Well, you're not a bachelor anymore," she'd said. "I'll need flour, cornmeal, eggs, butter, and a few other things. I'll make a list." They'd eaten a simple meal that night, fried bacon, beans heated in a pan, biscuits she'd somehow conjured from his minimal supplies. They'd sat at opposite ends of the small table, the silence broken only by the scrape of forks against tin plates and the crackle of the fire. Luke had tried several times to start a conversation, but every topic seemed fraught with difficulty. He couldn't ask about her childhood. That felt too intimate. Couldn't talk about their future. That seemed presumptuous. Couldn't even safely discuss the weather without it feeling like a desperate attempt to fill the void. Mara, for her part, had seemed content with the silence. She'd eaten efficiently, cleaned her plate, then washed the dishes in a basin of heated water, while Luke sat uselessly at the table, wondering what he was supposed to do with himself in his own home. "I'm tired," she'd announced when the dishes were dried and stacked. "It's been a long day." Luke had nodded, standing. He'd gestured vaguely toward the door, indicating his intention to give her privacy to change. "Don't be ridiculous," she'd said. "Turn your back if you need to. I'll not have my husband sleeping outside his own cabin." So Luke had turned to face the wall, listening to the rustle of fabric as she'd changed into what he'd assumed was a nightgown. His own clothes had felt too tight, too warm, and he'd had to resist the urge to loosen his collar. "I'm decent," she'd said finally. and he'd turned to find her already in the bed, covered to her chin with the quilt his mother had made years ago. She'd moved to the far edge, leaving a clear line of demarcation down the middle of the mattress. Luke had made his pallet on the floor using a spare blanket and his coat for a pillow. It had been uncomfortable and slightly ridiculous, but it had felt necessary, some small gesture of respect, or maybe just self-preservation. He'd lain there in the darkness, listening to Mara's breathing above him, wondering how in God's name they were going to make this work. "Luke?" Her voice had come soft through the darkness. "Yeah? Thank you for going through with it. I know this wasn't what you wanted." He'd thought about that, about what he'd wanted and what he'd gotten, about duty and obligation, and the hand fate had dealt them both. "Wasn't what either of us wanted," he'd said finally. "But we'll manage. Will we?" It hadn't been a challenge, just a genuine question, and Luke had found he had no answer to give her. So he'd said nothing, and eventually the sound of her breathing had evened out into sleep, and he'd been left alone with his thoughts and his doubts and the hard floor beneath his back. The days that followed had established a pattern that was part routine, part careful dance of avoidance. Luke rose before dawn, habit from years of ranch work, and slipped out of the cabin while Mara still slept. He'd tend to his horse, check the cattle, then head up to the main house where Cookie had coffee ready and breakfast laid out for the hands. By the time he'd returned to the cabin for midday dinner, Mara would have transformed the space in small ways. Curtains hung in the window, the floor swept clean, his clothes mended and folded neatly on the trunk. She'd taken to the domestic duties with the same practical efficiency she seemed to apply to everything. There was no complaint, no comment on the hardships of frontier life or the isolation of the cabin. She simply did what needed doing, and she did it well. The meals she prepared were simple but filling: cornbread and bean, stew made from the beef Thomas Garrett had given them as a wedding present, biscuits with gravy that somehow tasted better than anything Luke remembered eating in years. They'd fall into a routine at dinner. Luke would wash up at the basin outside, enter the cabin, and find her setting out plates. They'd sit, eat, and make awkward attempts at conversation that never quite found their footing. "Cattle looking healthy?" she'd ask. "Yeah, good grass this year." "That's good." Silence. "How was your day?" "Fine. Cleaned, mended your shirts?" "Thank you." More silence. It was like they were actors in a play, reciting lines neither of them believed, going through motions they'd seen other married couples perform without understanding the substance beneath the form. The town's reaction to their marriage had been predictably mixed. The men at the ranch had offered Luke gruff congratulations laced with poorly hidden pity. "Heard you got yourself hitched," one of the hands had said that first Monday. "To the Langley girl, that's something." The women had been worse. Mara had gone into town the following week to purchase supplies, and Luke had heard later from the shopkeeper that the ladies of Cottonwood Springs had given her the cold shoulder, their previous pity now transformed into something like vindictive satisfaction. Mrs. Henderson had actually said, within Mara's hearing, "Well, she got herself a husband finally. Wonder how long before he regrets it." Mara had reported none of this to Luke, but he'd seen it in the set of her shoulders when she'd returned, in the way she'd put away the supplies with sharp, angry movements. He'd wanted to say something, offer some comfort or solidarity, but the words had tangled in his throat and he'd said nothing, just watched her slam a bag of flour onto the shelf with more force than necessary. At night, Luke continued to sleep on the floor, despite Mara's repeated insistence that it was foolish. The truth was, he didn't trust himself, not because he feared he'd do something unwanted, but because the intimacy of sharing a bed felt like a deception when there was no intimacy between them. They were married in law, but strangers in fact, and Luke couldn't reconcile that contradiction. 2 weeks into the marriage, Thomas Garrett had called Luke up to the main house after supper. The rancher had poured them both whiskey and settled into his chair with the air of a man preparing for a difficult conversation. "How's married life treating you, Luke?" "Fine, sir." "Fine." Garrett had taken a sip of his drink, studying Luke over the rim of his glass. "That's the kind of answer a man gives when things are anything but fine." Luke had said nothing, and Garrett had sighed. "I've known you 4 years, Luke. You're the best foreman I've ever had. Hell, the best man I've ever had working for me. You're honest, hardworking, and you treat people fair, but you're also stubborn as a mule when it comes to your own welfare. I appreciate the concern, Mr. Garrett, but that girl you married, she's got a reputation, I know, but I've been thinking about it, and I wonder if maybe that reputation's been earned more by this town's narrow thinking than by anything she's actually done. Luke had looked up, surprised. My wife, God rest her, used to say that a woman who doesn't fit the mold gets broken by it or becomes stronger than steel. Your Mara strikes me as the latter type. Garrett had leaned forward. What I'm saying is, maybe you got luckier than you think. Maybe you both did. But you'll never know if you keep treating this marriage like it's a business contract instead of a partnership. The words had stayed with Luke long after he'd returned to the cabin that night, echoing in his mind as he'd lain on his floor pallet, listening to Mara breathe in the darkness above him. Maybe you got luckier than you think. It was a thought that terrified him more than any charging Confederate soldier ever had, because it suggested the possibility of something he'd long since given up on. The possibility that his life might hold something other than duty and hard work and the slow accumulation of years. It suggested hope, and hope was dangerous. Hope could break you worse than any bullet. 3 weeks into their marriage, on a hot afternoon in early July, Luke had returned to the cabin unexpectedly. One of the hands had gotten kicked by a horse and needed to be taken to the doctor in town, which meant Luke's work was done early. He'd approached the cabin quietly, not wanting to startle Mara, and that's when he'd heard it. Singing. She was singing while she worked, her voice low and surprisingly melodic, carrying through the open window of the cabin. Luke had frozen, caught between the desire to listen and the feeling that he was intruding on something private. The song was unfamiliar to him, something slow and melancholy, and her voice wrapped around the words with an emotion he'd never heard in her speaking voice. There was sadness in it, but also strength, and something else, something that sounded almost like longing. He'd stood there for longer than he should have, listening to her sing to an audience of no one, and in that moment, Luke had realized something that should have been obvious from the start. Mara was lonely. Just as lonely as he was, maybe more so, trapped in a marriage that was supposed to be her security, but instead had only reinforced her isolation. The singing had stopped, and Luke had waited a moment before making noise with his approach, calling out a greeting so she'd know he was coming. When he'd entered the cabin, she'd been standing at the stove, her back to him, and if she'd been singing moments before, there was no sign of it now. "You're back early," she'd said without turning. "Yeah, accident with one of the hands." "Is he all right?" "Will be. Took him to Doc Morrison." She'd nodded, stirring something in a pot, and Luke had stood there awkwardly, still hearing the echo of her singing in his mind. "Mara?" "Yeah? I heard you singing, before, when I was coming up to the cabin." Her back had stiffened, her stirring hand stilling. "Oh, it was beautiful. Your voice, I mean. I didn't know you could sing like that." She'd been quiet for a long moment, and when she'd finally turned to look at him, her expression had been guarded. "My mother used to sing. Taught me when I was little. It's just something I do sometimes, when I'm alone." "You don't have to be alone," Luke had said, the words escaping before he'd fully thought them through. Mara had studied him, and he'd seen a question in her eyes, one she'd been too proud or too afraid to ask aloud. Instead, she'd just turned back to the stove and said, "Supper will be ready soon." And the moment had passed, whatever vulnerability had flickered between them closing up like a wound that wasn't ready to heal. That night, Luke had lain awake on his floor pallet, thinking about singing and loneliness and the careful walls people built around themselves. He'd thought about his own walls, erected during the war when losing people you loved became a regular occurrence, reinforced every day since as he'd focused on work and obligation and the careful maintenance of emotional distance. He'd thought about Mara, standing in a saloon full of people who'd mocked her, lifting her chin and refusing to be diminished. He'd thought about her hands, rough from work, but gentle when she'd placed them in his during the ceremony. He'd thought about her voice, sad and strong and achingly alone, and he'd made a decision. "Mara?" He'd called softly into the darkness. "Yeah?" "The Harvest Festival. It's next month. Would you want to go? Together, I mean, as..." He'd struggled for the right word. as a couple. The silence had stretched so long he'd thought maybe she'd fallen asleep. Then, why? Because we're married, and maybe it's time we started acting like it. Another long silence, and then, barely audible, all right. Yes, I'd like that. Luke had felt something unknot in his chest, some tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. It wasn't much, just an agreement to attend a town social together. But it felt like a beginning, like the first careful step across a bridge he'd been afraid to cross. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and star-filled, and in the small cabin at the Triple Bar Ranch, two lonely people lay in the darkness, each wondering if maybe, possibly, they might have found something neither of them had been looking for. The decision to attend the Harvest Festival together changed something fundamental between them, though neither could have articulated exactly what. In the weeks that followed Luke's invitation, the silence in the cabin shifted from uncomfortable to companionable, punctuated by small exchanges that felt less like obligation and more like genuine curiosity. Mara had taken to asking him about the cattle, and Luke found himself explaining the intricacies of herd management with more detail than necessary, watching her face as she listened with genuine interest. She told him about her work at her father's forge, about the precise temperature needed to shape iron, about the satisfaction of transforming raw metal into something useful and beautiful. He'd never thought of blacksmithing as beautiful before, but the way she described it made him see it differently. Most people think it's just hammering hot metal, she'd said one evening as they sat on the porch steps watching the sun set behind the mountains. But it's more than that. You have to understand the metal, feel how it wants to move. Force it too much and it breaks. Work with it, and it becomes stronger than it ever was alone. Luke had looked at her profile in the fading light, wondering if she was talking about more than just blacksmithing. The night terrors had started 3 weeks after their wedding, though Luke didn't know Mara had been waking to them until she finally mentioned it one morning over breakfast. He'd bolted upright from his floor pallet sometime around 3 in the morning, shouting words she couldn't make out, his body rigid with a fear that had nothing to do with the quiet Montana night around them. "You were dreaming," she'd said simply, pouring him coffee with steady hands. "About the war, I think." Luke had felt shame crawl up his spine, hot and suffocating. "I'm sorry if I woke you. You've been doing it since we married. I just didn't think it was my place to mention it before." She'd set the coffee cup in front of him, then surprised him by sitting down at the table instead of busying herself with morning chores. "My father has them too. Not as often anymore, but they still come. He was at Shiloh." "Cold Harbor," Luke had said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "And the wilderness." Though Cold Harbor was, he'd trailed off, unable to find words for what Cold Harbor had been. "You don't have to talk about it," Mara had said, but her voice had held an invitation rather than a dismissal. So Luke had talked. Not about everything, some things would never leave the dark corners where he'd locked them away, but about the fear, about watching boys younger than him die in mud and blood, about his brother James who'd been 19 and full of foolish courage right up until a sharpshooter's bullet had ended all that courage in an instant. Mara had listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes about God's plan or necessary sacrifice. When he'd finished, she'd simply reached across the table and placed her hand over his, that rough, calloused hand that had somehow become familiar to him, and said, "The dreams don't make you weak. They make you human." It was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had said to him since he'd come home from the war. After that morning, something shifted. Luke found himself talking more, sharing small pieces of himself he'd kept locked away for years. Mara did the same, revealing the girl she'd been before the town decided she was unmarriageable. A girl who'd loved reading but whose family couldn't afford books, who'd wanted to travel but knew she'd never leave Montana, who'd learned to work iron because it was the only way to be close to her father after her mother died. "She passed when I was 14, Mara had told him one evening as they worked together in the small garden plot behind the cabin, her hands sure and quick as she pulled weeds. "Fever took her in 3 days. My father, he buried himself in work. The forge became his church, his confessional, his everything. So I learned to work it too, because it was the only way to reach him." "Is that why you never married before?" Luke had asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that's not—" "No, it's all right." She'd sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands. Partly that. Partly because I couldn't pretend to be something I wasn't. The boys in town, they wanted a wife who'd giggle at their jokes and keep her opinions to herself and bear children without complaint. I couldn't be that girl. Wouldn't be, even if I could. Good, Luke had said, surprising himself. The world's got enough of that kind of girl already. Mara had looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression had made his heart beat faster. You mean that? I do. She'd turned back to her weeding, but Luke had seen the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, and it had felt like a victory greater than any he'd won during the war. The preparations for the Harvest Festival consumed the town as August turned toward September. It was Cottonwood Springs' biggest social event of the year, a celebration of survival and community that brought together ranchers and townspeople, merchants and hired hands, everyone who'd made it through another hard Montana year. There would be food and music, competitions and dancing, all of it taking place in the field behind the church under a canopy of lanterns that would turn the night into something magical. Mara had seemed increasingly nervous as the date approached, though she tried to hide it. Luke would catch her standing at the cabin window, staring toward town with an expression he couldn't quite read. When he'd asked if she was having second thoughts about attending, she'd shaken her head. I'm not afraid of those people, she'd said, and he'd believed her. But there'd been something else in her voice, something vulnerable that she'd quickly covered with practicality. I just don't have anything to wear. The dress I wore to the wedding, it's the only nice dress I own, and everyone's already seen it. Luke had thought about the small amount of money he'd managed to save from his wages, money he'd been setting aside for winter supplies. What if we went to town tomorrow, to the dress shop? You could pick out fabric, have something made. Luke, that's expensive. We don't need to. I want to, he'd interrupted. You should have a new dress. You should have a lot of things you don't have. The next day, they'd ridden into Cottonwood Springs together, and Luke had felt the eyes following them as they made their way down Main Street. He'd helped Mara down from the wagon outside Mrs. Patterson's dress shop, keeping his hand at her elbow longer than necessary, a public declaration of solidarity that hadn't gone unnoticed. Inside the shop, Mrs. Patterson had greeted them with professional courtesy that barely masked her surprise. Mrs. McAllister? Mr. McAllister. How can I help you today? My wife needs a dress for the Harvest Festival, Luke had said, and he'd been proud of how natural the words had sounded. My wife. As if he'd been saying them for years instead of weeks. Mrs. Patterson had led them to the fabric displays, bolt after bolt of material in colors, ranging from practical browns to impractical silks. Mara had run her fingers over them with careful reverence, lingering longest on a bolt of pale blue cotton with tiny embroidered flowers. That one, Luke had said, it matches your eyes in certain light. Mara had looked at him, startled, and Mrs. Patterson had raised an eyebrow but said nothing, already making mental calculations about yardage and trim. It's too fancy, Mara had protested. Too expensive. It's perfect, Luke had countered, and we'll take it. The fitting had taken an hour, with Mrs. Patterson measuring and pinning while Mara stood rigid, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Luke had waited outside, smoking a cigarette and nodding to the townspeople who passed, their curiosity barely concealed behind polite greetings. Thomas Garrett had found him there, the rancher tipping his hat with a knowing smile. Heard you're taking your wife to the festival. That's right. Good man. It's about time this town learned some manners where that girl's concerned. Garrett had clapped him on the shoulder. My late wife, she had a saying, a man's measure isn't in what he takes, but in what he protects. You're protecting that girl's dignity, Luke. That's worth more than all the cattle in Montana. When Mara had emerged from the shop, she'd looked lighter somehow, as if the promise of a new dress had lifted something from her shoulders. They'd walked together to the general store to purchase supplies, and Luke had noticed the way she'd held her head a little higher, the way she'd met the stares of the townspeople with something approaching defiance. At the store, they'd encountered Rebecca Morrison, the doctor's daughter, a woman near Mara's age who'd always been held up as the model of proper femininity. Rebecca had looked Mara up and down with barely disguised contempt. Mara Langley, or I suppose it's McAllister now. Rebecca's voice had dripped with false sweetness. I heard about your marriage. Such a practical arrangement. Luke had felt Mara stiffen beside him, but before he could say anything, she'd stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and Rebecca until the other woman had been forced to step back. That's right, Rebecca, Mrs. McAllister. And yes, it's very practical. I got myself a husband who actually respects me, which is more than you can say about that banker's son you've been chasing for 3 years. Mara's voice had been calm, even pleasant, which had somehow made her words more devastating. Now, if you'll excuse us, my husband and I have shopping to do. She'd turned and walked away, leaving Rebecca sputtering, and Luke had followed, fighting the grin that threatened to break across his face. Outside the store, he'd finally let himself laugh, a real laugh that had felt rusty from disuse. "You're dangerous," he'd said, and Mara had smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that had transformed her entire face. Only when provoked. That night, they'd sat on the porch steps longer than usual, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air had been warm, carrying the scent of sage and pine, and for the first time since their wedding, the silence between them had felt comfortable, almost intimate. "Luke?" Mara's voice had been soft. "Why are you doing this? The dress, the festival, all of it. You don't have to try so hard. Our marriage, it is what it is." He'd thought about that question, about all the reasons he could give: duty, obligation, the desire to be a good man. But none of those had been the truth, or at least not the whole truth. Because somewhere between the wedding and now, you stopped being an obligation, he'd said finally. You became, I don't know what the right word is, a friend, maybe, or the possibility of something more than a friend. And I'm tired of sleeping on the floor, Mara. I'm tired of pretending this marriage is just a business transaction when every day I learn something new about you that makes me wish it was real. The words had hung in the air between them, more honest than anything Luke had said in years, and he'd held his breath waiting for her response. "It is real," Mara had said quietly. "Maybe it didn't start that way, but it's real now. At least it is for me." Luke had turned to look at her, and in the starlight he'd seen tears on her cheeks, though her voice had remained steady. "Mara, I'm not crying because I'm sad," she'd interrupted. "I'm crying because for the first time in my life someone sees me, really sees me. Not the town spinster, or the blacksmith's strange daughter, or the woman nobody wanted, just me." He'd reached for her hand then, threading his fingers through hers, and they'd sat like that until the stars filled the sky. Two people who'd started as strangers and were becoming something neither had dared to hope for. That night, Luke had climbed into bed beside her instead of making his usual pallet on the floor. They'd lain on opposite sides, still maintaining a careful distance, but it had felt like progress, like crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. "Good night, Mara," he'd whispered into the darkness. "Good night, Luke." The weeks leading up to the festival had passed in a blur of work and small intimacies. Mara had started bringing Luke his midday meal in the fields, riding out on the old mare from her father's stable, and they'd sit together under whatever shade they could find, talking about everything and nothing. The ranch hands had noticed, of course, and Luke had endured their good-natured ribbing about being wife-whipped, a term he'd corrected to wife-blessed, with enough seriousness that the jokes had stopped. Hugh Langley had visited the cabin one Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to check on his daughter, but really, Luke suspected, to take the measure of the man who'd married her. They'd sat on the porch while Mara made coffee, the old blacksmith studying Luke with eyes that missed nothing. "She's happier," Hugh had said finally. "I can see it in how she carries herself. You've been good to her." "She's made it easy," Hugh had smiled. "My daughter's many things, but easy ain't one of them. She's got her mother's fire and her own brand of stubbornness. The fact that you found a way to appreciate that instead of trying to break it says good things about you, son." When Mara had brought out the coffee, Luke had noticed the way she'd touched her father's shoulder in passing, a gesture of affection that spoke of healing, of walls coming down not just between husband and wife, but throughout her whole world. The dress had been ready 3 days before the festival, and Mrs. Patterson had delivered it personally to the cabin, a gesture that had surprised them both. The seamstress had lingered for a moment at the door, seeming to wage an internal battle before finally speaking. "Mrs. McAllister, I owe you an apology. I've been as bad as anyone in this town judging you without cause. but I've watched you these past weeks, how you carry yourself, how your husband looks at you, and I realize I've been wrong. I hope you'll accept my regret for that." Mara had been quiet for a long moment, and Luke had seen her wrestling with pride and forgiveness. Finally, she'd nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That means more than you know." After the seamstress had left, Mara had held the dress up against herself, a rare expression of pure joy crossing her face. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered. "You're beautiful," Luke had said, and he'd meant it. Not just the dress, not just the physical attributes that the town had deemed insufficient, but all of her. The strength, the vulnerability, the fierce pride and the tender heart she hid beneath it. Mara had looked at him, and something had shifted in the air between them, something electric and undeniable. She'd set down the dress and crossed to where he stood, reaching up to touch his face with fingers that trembled slightly. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan to. I didn't think I could. But I am." Luke had pulled her close then, really held her for the first time, feeling how perfectly she fit against him despite what the town had said about her ungainly build. "I know I'm falling in love with you," he'd said against her hair. "Have been for weeks now, just didn't know how to say it." They'd kissed then, not the brief, obligatory kiss of their wedding, but something real and deep and full of promise. When they'd finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Mara had smiled, that devastating, unguarded smile that Luke was learning to treasure. "The festival's in 3 days," she'd said. "I know. I'm nervous about the town, about what they'll say." "Let them say what they want," Luke had said fiercely. "You're my wife, Mara, my real wife in every way that matters, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The night before the festival, they'd finally consummated their marriage, coming together with a tenderness and passion that surprised them both. Afterward, lying tangled in sheets with Mara's head on his chest, Luke had felt something inside him heal, some wound from the war he hadn't known was still bleeding, finally beginning to close. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he'd asked, running his fingers through her hair. "With you beside me, I think I could face anything." The morning of the Harvest Festival had dawned clear and bright, the September air carrying just a hint of the autumn to come. Mara had spent hours getting ready, and when she'd finally emerged from behind the privacy screen wearing the blue dress, Luke's breath had caught in his throat. The dress fitted her perfectly, the color bringing out the gold in her brown eyes, the cut somehow both modest and flattering, emphasizing the strength of her shoulders and the curve of her waist. She'd left her hair down, dark waves falling past her shoulders, and she'd looked nervous and beautiful, and nothing like the woman the town had dismissed as unmarriageable. "Well?" she'd asked, turning slowly. "Will I shame you?" "You'll stop every heart in Cottonwood Springs," Luke had said honestly, "including mine." They'd arrived at the festival as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. The field behind the church had been transformed with long tables groaning under the weight of food, lanterns strung between poles waiting to be lit, and a platform erected for the musicians who were already tuning their instruments. The crowd had parted as Luke and Mara walked through, and Luke had heard the sudden hush, seen the heads turning, felt the weight of 100 stares. He'd tightened his grip on Mara's hand, felt her squeeze back, drawing strength from each other. "Is that Mara Langley?" someone had whispered, loud enough to be heard. "Mara McAllister," Luke had corrected firmly, and several people had had the grace to look embarrassed. They'd made their way to one of the long tables where Thomas Garrett and some of the other ranchers were gathered. Garrett had stood immediately, offering Mara his seat with courtly politeness. "Mrs. McAllister, you look absolutely lovely. That dress is stunning." "Thank you, Mr. Garrett," Mara had said, and Luke had heard the surprise in her voice. She'd clearly expected mockery, not genuine compliments. The evening had progressed with the usual festival activities. There was a shooting competition that Luke had won, much to the chagrin of Jacob Stern, the man whose nose Mara had broken at last year's dance. There were pie judging contests and horseshoe tournaments, children running wild between the tables while their parents gossiped and laughed. But through it all, Luke had been aware of the whispers, the glances, the town taking the measure of this strange marriage that had defied their expectations. Some of the stares were curious, some disapproving, but increasingly, Luke had noticed something else, a grudging respect perhaps, or at least a willingness to reconsider their judgments. As the sun set and the lanterns were lit, the musicians had struck up the first dance. Couples had moved on to the makeshift dance floor, and Luke had felt Mara stiffen beside him. "I should tell you," she'd said quietly. "I don't really know how to dance. Never had much occasion to learn." "That's all right," Luke had said, standing and offering his hand. "Neither do I. We'll figure it out together." He'd led her onto the dance floor, aware that every eye was on them, that this moment would be dissected and discussed in every household in Cottonwood Springs for weeks to come. The music had started, a slow waltz that the fiddler played with surprising sweetness, and Luke had taken Mara in his arms. They'd moved awkwardly at first, both of them stiff with self-consciousness. Luke had stepped on her foot, she'd stumbled over his, and for a moment it had seemed like they'd prove every doubt the town had ever had about them. But then Mara had laughed, a real laugh, full of genuine amusement rather than embarrassment, and somehow that had changed everything. Luke had found himself laughing too, and suddenly they'd been moving together, not perfectly, but with a grace born of trust rather than technique. The crowd that had been watching, waiting for failure, had grown quiet. Luke had seen it from the corner of his eye, the surprise, the shifting expressions, the slow recognition that what they were witnessing wasn't a spectacle to mock, but something genuine and real. Mara had looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and Luke had realized she'd felt it too. The moment when the town's perception had shifted, when they'd become not objects of pity, but a couple worth watching, worth perhaps even envying. "They're staring," she'd whispered. "Let them stare," Luke had said. "All I see is you." The song had ended, and for a moment the field had been silent. Then someone had started clapping. Hugh Langley, standing at the edge of the crowd with tears running down his weathered face, and others had joined in, hesitant at first but growing stronger, until the applause had washed over them like a wave. Mara had turned to face the crowd, and Luke had seen her chin lift, that familiar gesture of defiance transforming into something like victory. They'd walked off the dance floor together, and people had nodded to them, greeted them, some with warmth and others with grudging acknowledgement, but no longer with pity or contempt. Rebecca Morrison had approached, the banker's daughter who'd been so cruel in the general store. She'd stood before Mara, clearly uncomfortable, before finally speaking. That was lovely. The dance. You and Mr. McAllister. I wanted to say..." She'd paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easy. "I wanted to apologize for what I said at the store, for how I've treated you. It was unkind and unfair." Mara had studied her for a long moment, and Luke had held his breath, hoping she'd find it in herself to be gracious. Finally, Mara had nodded. "Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate you saying that." As the night had worn on, more people had approached, some to apologize, others simply to speak to Mara as if she were a regular person rather than a curiosity. Mrs. Henderson, who'd predicted Luke would regret his marriage, had actually asked Mara for her cornbread recipe. Old Mr. Wilson had told Luke he was a lucky man, and for once, there'd been no irony in the statement. Around midnight, as the festival had been winding down and families had been gathering their sleepy children for the ride home, Luke and Mara had found themselves alone at the edge of the field, looking out over the valley below where scattered lights marked the homesteads of their neighbors. "Did that really just happen?" Mara had asked, leaning against him. "Did this town actually accept us?" "Some of them did. Others will take more time, but tonight was a start." "You know what changed it?" She'd turned to look at him. "It was when you looked at me during that dance. Everyone saw it, saw how you looked at me. Like I was precious, like I mattered." "You do matter," Luke had said fiercely. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Mara. This marriage that was supposed to be a burden, it's turned out to be a blessing. You've turned out to be a blessing." She'd kissed him then, soft and sweet, uncaring of who might see, and Luke had pulled her closer, knowing that they still had a long road ahead, that acceptance from a town didn't erase years of hurt or guarantee an easy future. But it was something. It was a beginning. As they'd climbed into their wagon for the ride home, Hugh Langley had stopped them, placing his hand on Luke's arm. "Take care of my girl," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. Always, Luke had promised. And Mara, Hugh had turned to his daughter. I'm proud of you. Your mother would have been too. You stood tall tonight, girl, just like you always have. The ride back to the Triple Bar had been quiet, both of them lost in thought, processing the magnitude of what had happened. The town that had mocked their marriage had witnessed them transformed from objects of pity into something else entirely. A couple bound not by obligation, but by genuine feeling, by respect and affection, and the kind of love that couldn't be arranged or demanded, but only discovered. Back at the cabin, they'd undressed each other slowly, carefully, hanging up the beautiful blue dress and Luke's good suit. They'd climbed into bed, their bed now, without hesitation or division, and held each other in the darkness. Luke? Mara's voice had been drowsy, content. Yeah? Earlier, on the dance floor, you said I deserved better than what the town had given me. He'd remembered that moment of vulnerability and truth. I did say that, and I told you to show me how. You did. She'd been quiet for a moment, and when she'd spoken again, her voice had been filled with wonder. You showed me. Tonight, tomorrow, every day. You're showing me what it means to be seen, to be valued. Thank you for that. Luke had kissed her forehead, her temple, her lips, tasting salt from tears he wasn't sure were his or hers, or both. You don't need to thank me for treating you the way you've always deserved to be treated. Maybe not, but I'm grateful anyway. They'd fallen asleep like that, wrapped around each other, two people who'd been forced together by circumstance and had chosen to stay together by love. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and star-filled, full of promise and possibility. And in the small cabin at the Triple Bar Ranch, a marriage that had begun in obligation had transformed into something neither Luke nor Mara had believed possible. A partnership built on respect, affection, and the fierce determination to prove that love could grow even in the hardest soil. The morning after the festival, Luke had woken to find Mara already up, standing at the cabin window with her arms wrapped around herself, still wearing her nightgown. The early light painted her in shades of gold and shadow, and for a moment he'd simply watched her, this woman who'd become so essential to him in such a short time. You're thinking too loud, he'd said softly, and she'd turned with a small smile. Just remembering last night, wondering if it was real or if I dreamed it. Luke had climbed out of bed and crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. It was real. Every moment of it. They'll go back to how they were, Mara had said, and there'd been resignation in her voice rather than bitterness. One good night doesn't erase years of judgment. Maybe not all of them, but some will remember, and that's enough for now. She'd leaned back against him, and they'd stood like that watching the sun climb higher, neither speaking, just taking comfort in each other's presence. It was a moment of peace that Luke would remember later, when peace became something they had to fight for. The change had come on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the Harvest Festival, announced by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin at a gallop. Luke had been mending fence in the near pasture while Mara worked in the garden, and they'd both looked up as a rider came into view, pushing his horse harder than was wise on the rocky terrain. It was young Billy Patterson, the seamstress's son, and his face had been pale with urgency. "Mr. McAllister, come quick! There's fire at the forge!" Luke had dropped his tools and run for his horse, calling back to Mara, "Stay here!" But even as the words left his mouth, he'd known she wouldn't listen. By the time he'd thrown his saddle on and mounted, Mara had already hitched up the wagon, her face set with determination. "That's my father," she'd said, and there'd been no argument to make against that simple fact. They'd raced toward town, Luke on horseback, and Mara driving the wagon with a skill that spoke of years handling horses at the forge. The smell of smoke had reached them before they'd cleared the first hill, thick and acrid, carrying on the wind that seemed determined to fan whatever flames had started. Cottonwood Springs had been in chaos when they'd arrived. The forge sat at the east end of Main Street, close enough to other buildings that fire posed a threat to the entire town. A bucket brigade had already formed from the river, townspeople passing water hand to hand in a desperate attempt to contain the blaze, but even from a distance, Luke could see it was a losing battle. The forge was an inferno, flames shooting through the roof, the heat so intense that no one could get close enough to do any good. Believe it, Mara had started running toward the flames, and Luke had barely caught her, wrapping his arms around her waist and holding on even as she'd fought him with desperate strength. "Let me go! My father's in there!" "You can't help him if you're dead," Luke had said harshly, hating himself for the words but knowing they were true. The forge was fully engulfed, the heat radiating outward in waves that made it hard to breathe even at this distance. "Please," Mara had sobbed, all her fierce strength crumbling into terror. "Please. Someone has to help him." Luke had looked at the burning building, at the townspeople standing helpless with their buckets of water, at Mara's face twisted with anguish. He'd thought about duty and obligation, about the calculus of risk versus reward, about all the reasons a sane man wouldn't run into an inferno. And then he'd thought about what Mara had said that first night, standing in the saloon while people laughed at their wedding. "I'm not marrying them." She'd chosen him, chosen to trust him, to love him, to build a life with him. And that meant her father was his family now too. "Hold this," Luke had said, pulling off his hat and pressing it into her hands. Then he'd grabbed a blanket from the back of someone's wagon, dunked it in a water trough, and wrapped it around his shoulders like a cloak. "Luke, no!" Mara had reached for him, but he'd already started moving. The heat had been staggering, even through the wet blanket. Luke had kept his head down and his breathing shallow, pushing through the doorway of the forge, where flames licked at the frame. Inside, the smoke had been so thick he could barely see, his eyes immediately watering, his lungs burning with each breath. "Hugh!" he'd shouted, coughing. "Hugh Langley!" A crash had come from the back of the forge, and Luke had stumbled toward it, using the wet blanket to shield his face from the flames that seemed to be everywhere at once. He'd found Hugh collapsed near his workbench, unconscious or dead. Luke couldn't tell which, with a leather-bound journal clutched in his hands. Luke had grabbed the old blacksmith under the arms and dragged him toward the door, his own lungs screaming for clean air, his skin feeling like it was blistering even through his clothes. A beam had given way above them with a groan and a shower of sparks, and Luke had thrown himself forward, pulling Hugh through the doorway just as the ceiling collapsed behind them in an explosion of fire and burning timber. They'd tumbled down the steps together, and hands had reached for them. Townspeople pulling them away from the flames, beating out the embers that had caught on their clothes. Someone had pressed a wet cloth to Luke's face, and he'd sucked in air that felt like breathing glass, coughing so hard he'd thought his chest would crack. "Luke!" Mara had been there suddenly, her hands on his face, his shoulders, checking him for injuries with trembling fingers. "You stupid, brave, foolish man, you could have died." "Your father," Luke had managed between coughs. "Is he—" Doc Morrison had been kneeling beside Hugh, checking for breath and heartbeat. "He's alive. Smoke inhalation, probably some burns, but he's alive. Help me get him to my office." They'd carried Hugh to the doctor's office, while behind them the forge had continued to burn, the bucket brigade finally giving up and focusing instead on keeping the fire from spreading to other buildings. By some miracle and the grace of a wind that shifted at the right moment, the rest of Main Street had been saved. But the forge was a total loss, reduced to a smoking ruin of twisted metal and collapsed timbers. In Doc Morrison's office, Mara had sat by her father's side while the doctor worked, holding the old man's soot-blackened hand and crying silent tears that had broken Luke's heart. Hugh had regained consciousness after several long minutes, coughing and gasping, his first words barely audible. "The journal. Did I get the journal?" Mara had picked up the leather-bound book that had fallen beside him, its cover singed but intact. "You did, Pa. You got it. Your mother's recipes," Hugh had wheezed. "Couldn't let them burn. She wrote down every recipe she ever made, all her mother's recipes too. It's all we have left of her." Mara had pressed the journal to her chest, fresh tears streaming down her face, and Luke had understood then what Hugh had risked his life for. Not the forge itself, but the memories contained in that book, the last tangible connection to the wife he'd lost 10 years ago. Doc Morrison had shooed them out while he continued examining Hugh, and Luke and Mara had stumbled outside into the afternoon sunlight that seemed too bright, too normal for what had just happened. They'd sat on the doctor's porch steps, both of them still coughing, both blackened with soot and smelling of smoke. "Thank you," Mara had said, her voice hoarse. "Thank you for saving him. I don't know how to repay—" "You don't repay family," Luke had interrupted. "He's your father, which makes him mine too. That's what marriage means, Mara. Your people are my people. She'd turned to him then, and the look on her face had been so full of love and gratitude and pain that Luke had felt it like a physical thing. They'd held each other there on the steps, too exhausted and overwhelmed for words, just taking comfort in solid presence, in survival. The townspeople had started gathering as news of the fire spread. Thomas Garrett had been one of the first to arrive, taking in the scene with a grim expression. Luke, Mara, Doc says Hugh's gonna make it, thank God. He'd paused, studying Luke with an intensity that made Luke uncomfortable. What you did today, running into that fire, that took more courage than most men have in their whole lives. Anyone would have done it, Luke had said, but Garrett had shaken his head. No, most men would have stood there and watched it burn. You didn't even hesitate. The rancher had looked at Mara. Your husband's a hero, Mrs. McAllister. This town owes him a debt. The word of what had happened spread through Cottonwood Springs faster than the fire itself had spread through the forge. By evening, a steady stream of visitors had been coming to the doctor's office, some to check on Hugh's condition, others to see Luke and offer their thanks or their admiration, or simply to satisfy their curiosity. Jacob Stern had shown up, the man whose nose Mara had broken, standing awkwardly in the doorway with his hat in his hands. McAllister, I heard what you did. That was something. And Mrs. McAllister, I'm sorry about your father's forge. If there's anything I can do to help rebuild. It had been the first time anyone from town had offered help without being asked, and Luke had seen Mara's surprise, quickly hidden behind a nod of acknowledgement. But not everyone had been pleased by Luke's heroics. As the sun set and most of the well-wishers had departed, a group of men had gathered outside the doctor's office, their voices carrying through the open window. Damn fool nearly got himself killed, one voice had said. Luke had recognized it as belonging to Frank Dawson, a rancher who'd always been quick to voice his opinions. For what? A building that was going to fall apart anyway, and an old man too stubborn to leave when he should have. That old man's his wife's father, someone else had replied. Billy Patterson, the boy who'd ridden for help. Wife, Frank had snorted. That marriage was a joke from the start. Everyone knows he only married her to clear his daddy's debts. Now he's playing the hero to make himself feel better about being stuck with the Langley girl. Luke had been on his feet and through the door before he'd even realized he was moving. He'd grabbed Frank Dawson by the front of his shirt and slammed him against the wall of the doctor's office with enough force to knock the breath from him. Say that again, Luke had said, his voice deadly quiet. Say one more word about my wife, and I'll show you what a real joke looks like. Frank's friends had moved to intervene, but something in Luke's expression had stopped them. This wasn't the quiet, controlled foreman they all knew. This was a man pushed past the limits of his patience, a soldier who'd seen combat and knew exactly how much damage he could do. Luke! Mara had appeared in the doorway, her voice sharp with alarm. Let him go. Luke had released Frank, who'd stumbled away rubbing his chest and coughing. You're crazy, McAllister. No, I'm a husband defending his wife's honor. There's a difference. Luke had looked around at the gathered men, making sure they all understood. My marriage is real. My wife is the best thing that's ever happened to me. And if any of you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me. But I promise you won't like how that conversation ends. The men had dispersed, some grumbling, others looking thoughtful. Frank Dawson had left muttering threats about talking to Magistrate Crawford about assault, but nothing had come of it. The magistrate, when he'd heard the full story, had simply told Frank that a man who insults another man's wife should expect consequences. Back inside the doctor's office, Mara had turned on Luke with fire in her eyes. You can't go around threatening people. This town already has enough reasons to dislike me without you giving them more. I don't care if they dislike you, Luke had shot back. But I won't stand by and let them disrespect you. Not anymore. Not ever. Why? Mara had demanded. Why does it matter so much what they think or say? Because you're my wife. The words had come out louder than Luke had intended, echoing in the small office. Because I love you, and watching people mock you or pity you or act like our marriage is some kind of burden I'm carrying, it makes me want to hit something, preferably the people saying those things. Mara had stared at him, and Luke had realized it was the first time he'd said those words directly, without qualification or hesitation. I love you. 3 simple words that changed everything. You love me, she'd repeated, as if testing the words. I do. I have for weeks now. I just didn't know how to say it in a way that would make you believe it. She'd closed the distance between them, cupping his face with her soot-stained hands. I believe it. Because I love you too. Because I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. Because you ran into a burning building for my father without a moment's hesitation. She'd kissed him then, soft and fierce all at once. But you can't fight every battle for me, Luke. Some fights are mine to have. Then we fight them together, Luke had said. That's what partners do. Doc Morrison had emerged from the back room where Hugh had been resting, clearing his throat to announce his presence. Your father's asking for you, Mara. And Luke, I want to check those burns on your hands. Hugh had been sitting up in bed, his face still pale, but his eyes alert. Mara had rushed to him, and the old blacksmith had embraced her with surprising strength for a man who'd nearly died hours earlier. My foolish girl, he'd murmured into her hair. I heard you tried to run into that fire after me. I couldn't lose you, Mara had said, her voice breaking. And you've got a good man who wouldn't let you. Hugh had looked past his daughter to where Luke stood in the doorway. Come here, son. Luke had approached the bed, unsure what to expect. Hugh had extended his hand, and when Luke had taken it, the old blacksmith's grip had been surprisingly firm. You saved my life today. There's no debt that can repay that, but I want you to know, I'm grateful. And I'm grateful my daughter found a man who'd run into fire for her family. Hugh's eyes had been bright with emotion. You're a good man, Luke McAllister, better than I had any right to hope for when I made that arrangement. It stopped being an arrangement a long time ago, Luke had said. Mara's the best thing that ever happened to me, even if it took me a while to realize it. Hugh had smiled. Love's like that sometimes. Sneaks up on you when you're not looking. They'd stayed with Hugh until late into the night, Doc Morrison finally sending them home with instructions to return in the morning. The walk to where they'd left the wagon had been quiet, both of them processing the enormity of what had happened, how close they'd come to tragedy. The forge is gone, Mara had said as they'd climbed into the wagon. Everything my father built, all his tools, the work he had pending, it's all gone. It can be rebuilt. With what money? The forge was barely profitable as it was. There's no way Pa can afford to rebuild, especially not at his age. She'd been silent for a moment. He'll have to close the business, probably move in with us. He's got nowhere else to go. Luke had heard the worry in her voice, the fear that her father's misfortune would become their burden. Then he moves in with us. We'll figure it out, Mara. We always do. But over the next few days, as the full extent of the disaster became clear, Luke had realized that figuring it out would be more complicated than he'd thought. Hugh's burns had been worse than initially believed, bad enough that Doc Morrison had said he'd need weeks of recovery before he could work again. The forge had been uninsured. Hugh had let the policy lapse months ago to save money, which meant there was nothing to offset the total loss of his business and livelihood. The town's response had been mixed. Some people had donated money or materials to help with rebuilding, moved by Luke's heroism and Hugh's near-death experience. Others had used the opportunity to whisper that the Langleys had always been bad luck, that the fire was somehow proof of God's judgment, that decent people should keep their distance. Luke had wanted to punch every person who'd said such things, but Mara had held him back, her earlier words echoing, "You can't fight every battle for me." Instead, they'd focused on what they could control. Hugh had moved into the cabin temporarily, sleeping on a pallet in the corner while he recovered. It had been cramped and awkward, 3 adults in a space meant for one, but they'd made it work. Mara had tended to her father's burns with the gentleness that contrasted sharply with her usual brusque manner, and Luke had seen how much she loved the old man, how his suffering hurt her more than any insult the town could throw. Thomas Garrett had called Luke up to the main house one evening, about 2 weeks after the fire. The rancher had poured them both whiskey and settled into his chair with the air of a man about to make a serious proposition. "I've been thinking about Hugh Langley and that forge," Garrett had said without preamble. "Town needs a blacksmith, can't function without one, and Hugh's the best smithy we've had in 20 years. "He is," Luke had agreed, not sure where this was going. "Problem is, he's got no money to rebuild and no way to get it at his age. Banks won't loan to a man in his 60s with no collateral." Garrett had sipped his whiskey. "But I would." Luke had sat up straighter. Sir? I'm proposing to loan Hugh the money to rebuild his forge. Not as charity, but as a business investment. He rebuilds, gets back on his feet, pays me back over time with a small percentage of his profits. Everyone wins. That's incredibly generous, Mr. Garrett. It's good business, Garrett had corrected, and it's the right thing to do. That man nearly died trying to save his wife's memory. That kind of devotion deserves respect, not pity. He'd paused. But there's a condition. Luke had felt his stomach tighten. What condition? Hugh's getting old. He needs help running that forge, someone younger who can do the heavy work. I'm proposing he take on a partner, someone who will learn the trade and eventually take over when Hugh can't work anymore. I don't know much about blacksmithing, Luke had said slowly. Garrett had smiled. I wasn't thinking of you, Luke. I was thinking of your wife. The suggestion had caught Luke completely off guard. Mara? She already knows the trade, doesn't she? Worked alongside her father for years, and from what I've heard, she's got a natural talent for it. Garrett had leaned forward. This town's got some backwards ideas about what women can and can't do, but I'm a practical man, and I recognize skill when I see it. Your wife's got skill. Seems a waste not to use it. Luke had thought about Mara, about the way her face lit up when she talked about working iron, about the pride in Hugh's voice when he'd described her abilities. He'd thought about the town's reaction, about the gossip and judgment that would inevitably follow. And then he'd thought about what Mara had said on their wedding day, standing in that saloon while people laughed. I'm not marrying them. I think it's a brilliant idea, Luke had said, but it's not my decision to make. You'll have to ask Mara and Hugh. Garrett had grinned. Already planned to, just wanted to make sure you wouldn't have a problem with your wife working. My wife can do whatever she damn well pleases, Luke had said. I married a woman, not a possession. When Luke had returned to the cabin and told Mara about Garrett's proposition, her reaction had been a mixture of hope and disbelief. He wants to loan Pa the money to rebuild, and he wants me to work the forge? As a partner, equal stake in the business, eventually taking over when your father retires. Mara had sat down heavily at the table, staring at Luke as if he'd just told her the moon had fallen from the sky. No one in this town would accept that. A woman blacksmith? They'd run us out on a rail. Let them try, Luke had said. Mara, you're good at this work. Your father says you're better than he was at your age. Why shouldn't you do it? Because it's not proper, because women don't— To hell with proper, Luke had interrupted. To hell with what women are supposed to do. You want to work iron? Then work iron. Anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with me, Mr. Garrett, and your father. I'd like to see them get through all three of us. Hugh, listening from his pallet in the corner, had started laughing, a rough, painful sound that had turned into coughing, but laughter nonetheless. Boy's got a point, Mara. You've been hiding your light under a bushel your whole life because this town couldn't handle a woman with skill. Maybe it's time they learned to handle it. The decision had been made that night, though none of them had been under any illusions about how difficult the road ahead would be. Thomas Garrett had presented his proposal to Hugh the next day, with terms so generous that the old blacksmith had actually teared up reading them. The reconstruction would begin immediately, with Garrett advancing the funds and a crew of ranch hands providing the labor. But before any building could start, the ruins of the old forge had to be cleared. Luke had taken a day off from his ranch duties to help, and he'd been surprised when other men from town had shown up as well. Billy Patterson, some of the younger ranch hands, even Jacob Stern, though he'd avoided making eye contact with Mara. They'd work through the morning, pulling apart twisted metal and hauling away charred timbers, sorting through the wreckage for anything that might be salvaged. It had been hot, dirty work, and Luke's hands had still been tender from his burns, but there'd been something satisfying about it, something that felt like progress. Mara had worked alongside them, refusing to be relegated to bringing water or food like the other women would have been. She'd hauled debris with the same determination she brought to everything, and Luke had noticed the way some of the men had watched her, not with mockery or disapproval, but with a grudging respect for her strength and endurance. Around midday, Frank Dawson had ridden up, the same man Luke had slammed against the wall 2 weeks prior. The work had stopped as everyone turned to watch, wondering if there'd be trouble. Frank had dismounted slowly, approaching Luke with his hat in his hands. McAllister, Mrs. McAllister. He'd cleared his throat. I came to apologize for what I said that night after the fire. It was wrong of me. You proved yourself a good man that day. And your wife, well, any fool can see you two care for each other genuine. Luke had been so surprised he'd almost dropped the beam he was carrying. Mara had recovered faster, stepping forward with her chin raised. Apology accepted, Mr. Dawson. Thank you for saying that. Frank had nodded, then surprised them all further by picking up a shovel. Mind if I help? Figure I owe you folks that much. They'd worked through the afternoon, the crew growing as more townspeople heard what was happening and came to contribute. Mrs. Patterson had brought food. Old Mr. Wilson had donated lumber from his property. Even Reverend Paulson, who'd refused to marry them in his church, had stopped by to offer prayers and a monetary donation toward the rebuilding. By sunset, the site had been cleared, ready for construction to begin. The workers had dispersed, tired but satisfied, and Luke and Mara had stood alone amid the ashes of what had been, looking toward what might be built in its place. They came, Mara had said wonderingly. The town actually came to help. You sound surprised. I am surprised. After years of being invisible or worse, suddenly they see me. See us. She'd turned to Luke. That's because of you, because you made them see. No, Luke had said, pulling her close despite the soot and sweat covering them both. I just gave them permission to see what was always there. A strong, capable woman who deserved better than what they'd given her. You did the rest yourself. The forge had been rebuilt over the next 6 weeks, rising from the ashes like something reborn. It had been larger than the old one, with better ventilation and modern equipment that Thomas Garrett had insisted on including. Hugh had supervised the construction from a chair, his burns healing slowly but surely, offering advice and corrections with the authority of a man who'd spent his life mastering his craft. And when it had finally been finished, when the new forge stood complete with its fresh timber and solid stone foundation, the town had gathered for an informal dedication. Magistrate Crawford had said a few words about resilience and community, though Luke had noticed he'd carefully avoided mentioning Mara's role in the forge's future. Thomas Garrett had been less circumspect. This forge represents more than just a building, the rancher had said, addressing the crowd that had gathered. It represents this town's willingness to help one of our own in time of need. And it represents a new partnership. Hugh Langley and his daughter Mara will be running this forge together, combining his experience with her skill to serve Cottonwood Springs for years to come. The announcement had caused a ripple of surprise through the crowd, exactly as they'd expected. Luke had watched faces carefully, seeing the range of reactions, some approving, some skeptical, some openly disapproving. Rebecca Morrison had been the first to speak up, her voice cutting through the murmurs. A woman blacksmith? That's unprecedented. So was a woman breaking your brother's nose at last year's dance? Someone had called out. Luke had been surprised to realize it was Billy Patterson. But she managed that just fine. Laughter had broken the tension, and Rebecca had had the grace to look embarrassed. Mara had stepped forward then, her voice steady and strong. I know this town has certain ideas about what women should and shouldn't do. I've lived my whole life with those ideas trying to shape me into something I'm not. But I'm good at this work. I'm skilled at it. And I'm not going to hide that skill anymore just to make people comfortable. She'd paused, looking out at the faces watching her. My father taught me everything he knows. This forge is as much mine as it is his, and anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to take their business elsewhere. The silence that had followed had been absolute. Luke had held his breath, wondering if they'd just made a terrible mistake, if Mara's directness had pushed too hard against the town's sensibilities. Then Hugh had struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane, and put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. My girl speaks the truth. She's the finest smith I've ever trained, and I've trained more than a few in my years. This forge survives because of her as much as because of anyone's charity, and I'll not hear a word against her character or her capability. Thomas Garrett had added his voice. I wouldn't have invested in this forge if I didn't believe in both Langley's ability to make it profitable. I'm a businessman first, and this is good business. Slowly, people had begun to nod. Some had still looked doubtful, but others had seemed to accept the logic of it, or at least were willing to reserve judgment. The gathering had broken up shortly after, people drifting away in small groups, their voices carrying speculation and debate. But 3 days later, when the forge had officially reopened for business, there'd been a line of customers waiting, farmers needing tools repaired, ranchers needing horseshoes, housewives needing pots mended. And Mara had stood at that forge alongside her father, her leather apron tied around her waist and her hammer in her hand, and she'd worked iron like she'd been born to it. Luke had stopped by at midday to check on them, ostensibly to have his own horse reshod, but really just to see how Mara was managing. He'd found her at the anvil, shaping a piece of glowing metal with precise, confident strikes, while Hugh worked at the bellows, keeping the fire hot. She'd looked up when Luke had entered, her face flushed from the heat, sweat dampening her hair, and she'd smiled, a smile so full of joy and satisfaction that Luke had felt his heart constrict with love for her. "How's it going?" he'd asked. "We've got more work than we can handle," Hugh had said, gesturing to the pile of tools and equipment waiting for attention. "Word spreads fast when you're the only forge in 50 miles. And people are accepting it? You working here?" Mara had set down her hammer, flexing her shoulders. "Some are, some aren't. Mrs. Henderson brought in a pot to be mended, took one look at me and took it right back out again. But Mr. Wilson stayed and watched me work for half an hour, then said he'd never seen finer work, and would I make him a new set of gate hinges. That's my girl," Hugh had said with pride. Luke had watched them work together, father and daughter, moving around the forge with practiced ease, and he'd realized that this was what Mara had always been meant to do. Not to conform to someone else's idea of what a woman should be, but to claim her own space, her own skill, her own power. That evening, as they'd ridden back to the Triple Bar together, Mara had been quiet, and Luke had sensed something weighing on her mind. "What is it?" he'd asked finally. "I'm happy," she'd said, and there'd been wonder in her voice. "I'm actually genuinely happy. I'm doing work I love. I have a husband who supports me. My father's alive and healing. And it scares me, Luke, because I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for this all to be taken away." Luke had pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. "Nothing's going to take this away. We fought too hard for it, both of us. This is our life now, Mara. Not perfect, not without its challenges, but ours. And I'll be damned if I let anything or anyone destroy what we've built." She'd kissed him then, there on the road with the sunset painting the sky in fire colors, and Luke had tasted salt on her lips, tears of joy, or relief, or maybe just release of all the fear she'd been carrying. "I love you," she'd whispered against his mouth. "I love you so much, it terrifies me." "Good," Luke had said, "because I love you the same way, and it's much less terrifying when you're not alone in it." They'd made it back to the cabin as darkness fell, and for the first time since Hugh had moved in, they'd had the place to themselves, the old blacksmith having insisted on staying in town near the forge, sleeping in a small room they'd built adjacent to the workshop. That night, Luke and Mara had celebrated their happiness the way married couples do, with passion and tenderness and the kind of intimacy that comes from truly knowing another person. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Luke had thought about how far they'd come from that awkward wedding day when they'd been strangers bound by obligation. "Luke?" Mara's voice had been sleepy, content. "Yeah? When you ran into that fire for my father, I realized something." "What's that?" "That you'd become my family, really, truly my family. Not just because we said words in a saloon, but because you chose to be. You chose us." She'd been quiet for a moment. "Thank you for choosing us." Luke had held her tighter, overwhelmed by the simple, profound truth of what she'd said. He had chosen them, chosen Mara, chosen Hugh, chosen this life that had started as a burden and become a blessing. And in choosing them, he'd finally found what he'd been searching for since the war ended. A reason to live instead of just existing, a future worth building instead of just enduring. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and star-filled, and inside their small cabin, two people who'd found each other against all odds slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they'd face them together. Winter came early to Montana that year, arriving in late October with snow that fell thick and heavy, blanketing the valley in white that seemed to muffle the whole world. Luke had seen worse winters during the war, But there was something about this one that felt different, not threatening, but cocooning, as if nature itself had decided to wrap them in silence and give them time to simply be. The work at the forge had continued through the cold months, though the number of customers had decreased as traveling became more difficult. Mara had used the quieter time to learn more advanced techniques from her father, perfecting her skill with decorative ironwork that Hugh insisted would be profitable come spring. Luke would stop by some afternoons after finishing his ranch duties, standing in the doorway and watching her work, mesmerized by the way she transformed raw metal into something beautiful. "You're staring again," she'd said one day without looking up from the piece she was shaping, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Can't help it. You're beautiful when you work." "I'm covered in soot and sweat. Still beautiful." Hugh had chuckled from where he sat mending a leather harness. "You two are going to make me sick with all this sweetness. Never thought I'd see the day my daughter turned soft." "I'm not soft," Mara had protested, but her tone had been gentle, affectionate in a way it never would have been before the fire, before the rebuilding, before she'd learned that accepting love didn't make her weak. The ranch work had slowed too with the winter, giving Luke more time at the cabin. He'd spent those long evenings teaching Mara to read better than the rudimentary skills she'd learned as a child, using the few books Thomas Garrett had loaned them and the newspapers that came weekly from Helena. She'd taken to reading with the same fierce determination she applied to everything, staying up late by lamplight practicing her letters until Luke would gently take the book from her hands and pull her to bed. They talked about the future during those quiet winter nights, making plans that felt both terrifying and thrilling in their possibility. Mara wanted to expand the forge's offerings, to do more custom work that would bring in customers from other towns. Luke had been setting aside money with the dream of eventually buying a small piece of land where they could build their own ranch, something modest, but entirely theirs. "I want children," Mara had said one night, the words coming out of nowhere as they lay in bed listening to wind howl around the cabin. "I never thought I did. Never thought I'd have the chance. But now, with you, I want them." Luke had felt something expand in his chest, a future suddenly becoming more real and tangible than it had ever been. "How many?" "I don't know. 2, 3, enough to fill this cabin with noise and chaos." She'd turned to look at him in the darkness. "Does that scare you?" "Terrifies me," Luke had admitted, "but in a good way. The kind of scared that means you're about to do something that matters. We'll need a bigger place. This cabin's barely big enough for the two of us. We'll build one, on our own land, with our own hands. We'll build something that lasts." Mara had kissed him then, soft and sweet, and they'd made love with a new sense of purpose, as if in doing so they were laying the foundation for all those future possibilities, the children, the land, the life they were choosing to create together. But winter in Montana had a way of testing people, of finding weaknesses and exploiting them. The test had come in late December, when a rider from town had appeared at the cabin just after dawn, his horse labored and steaming in the frigid air. "Mr. McAllister, you need to come quick. There's been trouble at the forge." Luke had been up and dressed before the man finished speaking, his war-trained instincts kicking in. Mara had been right behind him, her face pale but determined. "What kind of trouble?" Luke had demanded. "Fire. Someone set fire to the forge. Your father-in-law's trapped inside." The words had hit Luke like a physical blow, and he'd seen Mara sway as if she might fall. Not again. They couldn't go through this again. The ride into town had been frantic, the horses pushed as hard as they dared on the icy roads. Luke's mind had been racing, trying to understand how a fire could have started in winter, when everyone was so careful with flames, when Hugh would have banked the forge fire before going to sleep. Unless it hadn't been an accident. They'd arrived to find the forge burning again, but this time the fire had been smaller, more contained. A bucket brigade had already formed, and men were throwing snow onto the flames as much as water. Hugh had been outside, thank God, his face blackened with soot, but otherwise unharmed, being tended to by Doc Morrison. "Pa!" Mara had leaped from the wagon before it had fully stopped, running to her father and throwing her arms around him. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, girl. Got out in time." Hugh's voice had been rough with smoke and anger. But it wasn't an accident. Someone did this deliberately. Luke had felt cold settle into his bones that had nothing to do with the winter temperature. "What do you mean?" I mean, I woke to the smell of kerosene. Someone poured it around the outside of the building and lit it. If I hadn't woken when I did, if the wind hadn't been blowing the smoke away from my room, Hugh had trailed off, the implication clear. Magistrate Crawford had been there, along with several of the town's leading men, examining the scene with grim faces. Luke had joined them, looking at the scorch marks that clearly showed where the fire had been started, at the empty kerosene can that had been left near the woodpile. This was arson, Crawford had said flatly. Someone tried to burn down this forge, tried to kill Hugh Langley while they were at it. Who would do such a thing? Thomas Garrett had demanded, his face flushed with anger. Someone who doesn't like the idea of a woman working a forge, Frank Dawson had said quietly, and all eyes had turned to him. I'm not saying I know who did it, but there's been talk. Some of the older folks, some of the more traditional types, they've been saying it's unnatural, what Mara's doing, that it goes against God's order. Luke had felt rage building in him, hot and dangerous. So someone tried to commit murder because they don't like how we live our lives? I'm not defending it, Frank had said quickly. I'm just telling you what I've heard. The fire had been put out before it could do major damage, but the message had been clear. Not everyone in Cottonwood Springs had accepted the changes that Mara and Luke represented. Someone had been angry enough, threatened enough by a woman claiming a man's role to try to destroy what they'd built. The investigation had begun immediately, with Magistrate Crawford questioning everyone who'd been seen near the forge in recent days. But winter meant fewer people were out and about, fewer witnesses to anything suspicious. The culprit had chosen their timing well. Mara had refused to be intimidated. The next morning, despite Luke's protests, she'd been at the forge with her father, cleaning up the damage and making repairs. Her face had been set with determination that Luke recognized. She wouldn't be driven away by fear or threats. You should let this go, Luke had said, watching her work. At least until they catch whoever did this. Oh, let it go? Mara had turned on him, her eyes blazing. That's exactly what they want, Luke. They want me to be scared, to give up, to go back to being what they think a woman should be, quiet and invisible and safely contained in someone's kitchen. Well, I won't do it. I won't give them that satisfaction. I'm not asking you to give up. I'm asking you to be safe. Safety's an illusion, she'd said, turning back to her work. I learned that when my mother died, when the town decided I was unmarriageable, when my father nearly burned to death the first time. You can spend your whole life trying to be safe and still lose everything. At least this way I'm losing it while doing something I love. Hugh had placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. She's right, son. Hard as it is to accept, she's right. We back down now. We're teaching whoever did this that violence works, that threats work. I won't live my life like that, and I won't ask my daughter to either. So they'd continued, but Luke had made sure one of them was always at the forge, always watching. He'd moved some of his things into the small room adjacent to the workshop, spending nights there even though it meant being away from Mara. He'd rigged up bells and alarms, things that would alert them if anyone approached the forge after dark. The town had been divided in its response to the arson. Some people, like Thomas Garrett and Doc Morrison, had been outraged, demanding justice and offering protection. Others had been more circumspect, suggesting that perhaps Mara should consider whether her presence at the forge was worth all this trouble. And a few, a vocal minority, had suggested that the fire was God's judgment on unnatural behavior. Reverend Paulson had preached a sermon the Sunday after the fire about proper roles and divine order, about how chaos comes when people forget their place in God's plan. Mara and Luke hadn't been there to hear it, but enough people had told them about it that the message was clear. He's afraid, Mara had said when Luke had reported what he'd heard. They're all afraid. Because if I can step outside the role they've assigned me, if I can be successful at it, then maybe their whole understanding of how the world should work is wrong. And that's terrifying to people who need everything to fit in neat little boxes. It had been Rebecca Morrison, of all people, who'd provided the break in the case. She'd come to the forge 2 weeks after the arson, her face pale and her hands trembling. I need to speak with you, she'd said to Mara, her voice barely above a whisper. Privately. They'd stepped outside into the cold afternoon, and Rebecca had wrapped her arms around herself, clearly struggling with whatever she'd come to say. I know who started the fire, she'd said finally. Or at least, I'm fairly certain I do. Mara had gone very still. Who? My father. Rebecca's voice had broken on the words. I heard him talking to some other men, Mr. Henderson and Mr. Pritchard from the general store. They were saying that you needed to be taught a lesson, that someone had to show you that there are consequences for stepping outside your proper sphere. Did you hear him admit to starting the fire? Not exactly, but he had kerosene on his clothes that night. I smelled it, and he came home late, much later than he should have been out. And the way he was talking, the satisfaction in his voice, Rebecca had started crying. I'm so sorry. I should have come forward sooner. He's my father. How do you turn in your own father? Mara had pulled the younger woman into an unexpected embrace. You just did something incredibly brave. Thank you. Magistrate Crawford had arrested Dr. Morrison that evening, along with Henderson and Pritchard. The evidence had been largely circumstantial, but combined with Rebecca's testimony and the kerosene stains on Morrison's work clothes that his wife hadn't been able to wash out completely, it had been enough for an indictment. The trial had been set for early spring, when travel would be easier and a proper judge could be brought in from Helena. In the meantime, the three men had been released on bond, required to stay away from the forge and the Langleys. It had been an imperfect solution, but it was something. The revelation that Dr. Morrison, one of the town's most respected citizens, had tried to burn down the forge had sent shockwaves through Cottonwood Springs. Some people had refused to believe it, claiming Rebecca was lying or mistaken. Others had been forced to confront their own prejudices, to ask themselves what they'd been willing to tolerate or ignore in the name of tradition. Luke had found himself in an unexpected position of influence. As the man who'd saved Hugh's life not once, but who'd also stood by Mara's decision to work the forge, he'd become a symbol of sorts, proof that a man could support his wife's ambitions without being diminished by them. You've become a leader, Thomas Garrett had told him one evening over whiskey. Maybe not one you wanted to be, but a leader nonetheless. The younger men especially, they watch how you are with Mara, how you support her. You're teaching them a different way of being a husband, a different way of being a man. I'm just loving my wife, Luke had said uncomfortably. Don't see how that makes me a leader. That's exactly what makes you one, Garrett had replied. Real leadership isn't about telling people what to do. It's about showing them what's possible. As winter had deepened toward its coldest months, the community had slowly begun to shift. It hadn't been a dramatic change, no sudden reversal of long-held beliefs. But small things had started to happen, tiny cracks in the walls of tradition. Mrs. Patterson had brought her daughter to the forge, asking if Mara would teach the girl some basic metalworking. She's got a knack for it, the seamstress had said. Seems a shame to waste it just because she's female. Young Billy Patterson had started courting Sarah Jenkins, the piano player from the saloon, openly declaring that he didn't care if she worked or stayed home, as long as she was happy. My wife's going to be my partner, he'd told his friends. Not my property. Luke McAllister taught me that. Even Reverend Paulson had moderated his tone, preaching a sermon about how God's gifts should be used regardless of who received them, about how the Bible was full of strong women who'd stepped outside traditional roles when called to do so. The change had been slow, grudging, often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But it had been real, and it had started with Luke and Mara's refusal to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them. Through it all, their love had deepened and matured. They'd learned to fight fairly, to compromise without sacrificing their core values, to give each other space while still maintaining intimacy. They'd learned that marriage wasn't about losing yourself in another person, but about becoming more fully yourself, because someone else saw you clearly and loved what they saw. One evening in late February, as they'd sat by the fire in their cabin with snow falling thick outside the windows, Mara had taken Luke's hand and placed it on her stomach. We're going to need that bigger house sooner than we thought, she'd said softly. It had taken Luke a moment to understand, and when comprehension had finally hit him, he'd felt like all the air had left his lungs. You're about 2 months along, I think. I wanted to be sure before I told you. Luke had pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions so intense he couldn't name them all. Joy and terror and wonder and responsibility all mixed together. We're having a baby. We're having a baby, Mara had confirmed, and there'd been tears in her voice that matched the tears on Luke's face. They'd held each other for a long time, not speaking, just absorbing the magnitude of what they'd created together. A new life, a new person who would be half Mara and half Luke, who would grow up knowing that their mother had been strong enough to claim her own path, and their father had been secure enough to celebrate her for it. "Are you scared?" Mara had asked eventually. "Terrified," Luke had admitted, "but also more hopeful than I've been since before the war. This child is going to grow up in a different world than we did, Mara. A world where maybe they won't have to fight so hard just to be themselves." "We'll make sure of it," Mara had said fiercely. "Whatever it takes, we'll make sure they grow up knowing they can be anything, do anything, love anyone. No boxes, no limitations, except the ones they choose for themselves." The news of Mara's pregnancy had spread through Cottonwood Springs with the speed that all good gossip travels in a small town. The responses had been mixed but largely positive, with women who'd previously kept their distance suddenly offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Even Mrs. Henderson, who'd been one of Mara's harshest critics, had shown up at the cabin with a beautiful quilt she'd made, decorated with stars and mountains. "Every child deserves a warm welcome," she'd said gruffly, thrusting the quilt into Mara's hands. "Even if I don't agree with everything their mama does." Mara had accepted the gift with grace, understanding that this was as close to an apology as she was likely to get from the older woman. Hugh had been overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, immediately beginning work on a cradle made from oak, carving intricate designs into the headboard during the long winter evenings. "This child's gonna know they're loved," he'd said, his scarred hands moving gently over the wood. "Going to know they come from people who fought for what matters." As winter had finally begun to release its grip on the valley, and the first hints of spring had appeared in the warming air and melting snow, Luke had started building the house they'd dreamed about. Thomas Garrett had sold him 10 acres of triple bar land at a price so reasonable it was essentially a gift, situated in a pretty spot near a creek with a view of the mountains. Every evening after finishing his ranch work, Luke had gone to the property and worked on the house, laying foundation stones and framing walls. Mara had joined him when she could, her pregnancy not yet advanced enough to slow her down, and together they'd literally built their future with their own hands. Other men had started showing up to help: Billy Patterson, some of the ranch hands, even Frank Dawson, who'd become an unlikely ally. They'd worked through the lengthening days of early spring, raising walls and putting on a roof, creating something solid and real and permanent. The house had been simple but well built, with 2 rooms downstairs and space in the loft for children to sleep as their family grew. It had real glass windows that Luke had ordered from Helena, a proper stone fireplace that Hugh had helped design, and a wide porch that faced west toward the mountains where they could sit and watch the sunset. The day they'd moved in, carrying their few possessions from the cabin to the new house, had been one of the happiest of Luke's life. The house had smelled of fresh timber and possibility, and when he'd carried Mara over the threshold, she'd laughed with pure delight. "It's perfect," she'd said, looking around at the space they'd created. "It's absolutely perfect." "It's ours," Luke had replied, and that word had contained everything that mattered. Ours. Not his, not hers, but theirs together, built by their hands, paid for by their work, a physical manifestation of the life they'd chosen to create. That night, they'd made love for the first time in their new home, christening the bed Luke had built with his own hands. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Luke had felt a contentment so deep it almost frightened him with its intensity. "I love you," he'd said, not for the first time, but somehow feeling like the words meant more here, in this place they'd built together. "I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," Mara had replied, her hand finding his in the darkness. "You took a woman no one wanted and made her feel precious. You took a marriage based on debt and transformed it into something real. You gave me back myself, Luke. How do I ever repay that?" "You already have," Luke had said. "Every day, every moment. You're my redemption, Mara. After the war, I thought I'd lost the ability to feel anything but duty and obligation. But you taught me how to love again, how to hope, how to believe that the future could be something other than just surviving from one day to the next." They'd fallen asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when Luke had woken in the night to check on her, as he always did, he'd found her sleeping peacefully, one hand resting on her stomach where their child grew, a small smile on her face, even in sleep. The trial of Dr. Morrison and the other two men had taken place in late April, with a judge brought in from Helena to preside. The whole town had turned out for it, packing into the saloon where the proceedings were held, and the testimony had been damning. Rebecca had been the star witness, her testimony about what she'd heard and seen unshakable, despite her father's attorney's attempts to discredit her. Other witnesses had come forward too, people who'd heard Morrison and his co-conspirators talking about teaching Mara a lesson, who'd seen them near the forge at odd hours, who'd noticed the kerosene stains and furtive behavior. The verdict had been guilty on all counts, and the judge had sentenced each man to 2 years' hard labor and substantial fines to be paid to Hugh Langley for damages and emotional distress. It had been a harsh sentence by frontier standards, but the judge had been clear about his reasoning. This court will not tolerate vigilante justice or violence against citizens who choose to live their lives in ways that don't conform to traditional expectations, he'd said. Mrs. McAllister broke no laws in working her father's forge. She harmed no one. She simply refused to accept limitations that had no basis in law or reason. That these men would respond with arson and attempted murder speaks to a moral failure that requires serious consequences. Dr. Morrison had been led away in chains, and Luke had felt Mara's hand tighten in his. She hadn't looked happy about the verdict exactly, but there'd been a sense of vindication in her expression, of justice finally being served. Rebecca had left Cottonwood Springs the day after the trial, unable to remain in a town where everyone knew her father was a criminal. But before she'd gone, she'd come to say goodbye to Mara. "Thank you," she'd said quietly, "for not hating me, for understanding that what he did wasn't my fault." "None of us can control what our parents do," Mara had replied. "We can only control how we respond to it. You responded with courage and honesty. That takes strength." After Rebecca had left, Mara had turned to Luke with tears in her eyes. "I feel sorry for her. She lost her father, her reputation, probably any chance at marriage in this territory. And for what? For telling the truth. For doing the right thing." "The right thing usually costs something," Luke had said gently. "That's why it's called the right thing and not the easy thing." As spring had turned towards summer and Mara's pregnancy had become obvious to everyone, the town had seemed to finally exhale, to let go of the tensions that had been building since that first controversial wedding in the Silver Spur Saloon. New families had moved to the area, people who hadn't been part of the old conflicts and didn't carry the weight of tradition in the same way. The forge had prospered, with customers coming from as far as 50 miles away to have work done by the skilled father-daughter team who'd become something of a legend in the territory. Mara had continued working almost up until the end of her pregnancy, finally stopping only when she'd become too large to safely maneuver around the forge. "I feel useless," she'd complained one evening in late July, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "I should be working." "You are working," Luke had said, kneeling beside her chair and placing his own hands over hers. "You're growing our child. That's the most important work there is." "You're just saying that to make me feel better." "I'm saying it because it's true." He'd kissed her stomach gently. "This little person in here, they're going to change the world, Mara. Or at least they're going to change our world. That's worth more than any amount of horseshoes or gate hinges." Their daughter had been born on a hot August night, delivered by Doc Morrison's wife, who'd taken over much of his practice after his imprisonment. It had been a difficult labor, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there'd been moments when Luke had been genuinely terrified that he might lose Mara, that this woman who'd become his entire world might slip away from him just when they'd finally found happiness. But Mara had been strong, stronger than Luke had ever imagined anyone could be, and when their daughter had finally emerged into the world, red-faced and screaming with the outrage of the newly born, Luke had felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. "She's perfect," Mara had whispered, exhausted but radiant as she'd held their daughter. "Look at her, Luke. We made this. We made something perfect." They'd named her Grace, after Luke's mother, and Catherine, for Mara's mother, and from the moment she'd drawn her first breath, Grace Catherine McAllister had owned both her parents completely. Hugh had cried when he'd first held his granddaughter, this tiny person who represented the future they'd all been fighting for. "She'll never have to hide who she is," he'd said softly. She'll never have to pretend to be less than she is just to make other people comfortable. You've given her that gift, both of you. You fought for a world where she can be anything she wants to be. The house that had seemed so large when they'd first moved in had suddenly felt full, alive with the sounds of a baby's cries and coos and the constant activity of new parenthood. Luke had discovered reserves of patience he hadn't known he possessed, learning to function on minimal sleep while still maintaining his duties at the ranch. Mara had taken to motherhood with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, though Luke could see the way she missed the forge, the way her hands itched for hammer and anvil. "Go back when you're ready," he'd told her one evening as she'd nursed Grace. "I'll watch her. Your father will watch her. We'll figure it out." "You don't mind?" "Mind my wife doing work she loves? Mind our daughter seeing her mother as strong and skilled and unafraid to claim her own path?" Luke had shaken his head. "That's exactly what I want her to see. I want Grace to grow up knowing that women are just as capable as men, that love doesn't require sacrifice of self, that marriage is a partnership of equals." Mara had looked at him with such love and gratitude that Luke had felt it like a physical warmth. "How did I get so lucky?" she'd asked. "How did the woman everyone rejected end up with the best man in Montana?" "I'm the lucky one," Luke had countered. "You taught me how to live again, Mara. How to be more than just a shell going through the motions. You gave me back my humanity." As summer had faded toward autumn, and Grace had grown from a helpless newborn into a baby who smiled and laughed and recognized her parents, Luke had reflected on how far they'd come. Less than 2 years ago, he'd stood in a saloon marrying a woman he didn't know to settle a debt he hadn't incurred, both of them resigned to a life of obligation and mutual tolerance at best. Now he had a wife he loved more than his own life, a daughter who'd already wrapped him around her tiny finger, a home they'd built together, and a future that stretched before them bright with possibility. The town that had once mocked their marriage now pointed to them as an example of what partnership could look like, how two people who chose to support each other could achieve more than either could alone. It hadn't been easy. God knew it hadn't been easy. There'd been fire and threats and trials, moments of doubt and fear and pain, but they'd faced it all together, and in facing it, they'd become something stronger than either had been separately. One evening in late September, almost exactly a year after that fateful Harvest Festival dance, Luke and Mara had sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Grace sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "Do you ever think about that night?" Mara had asked. "The festival? When everything changed?" "I think about it all the time," Luke had admitted. "I think about how scared we both were, how uncertain, and how one dance changed everything." "It wasn't the dance," Mara had said softly. "It was you. The way you looked at me like I mattered, like I was precious. That's what changed everything. You saw me when no one else would." "I saw what was always there," Luke had corrected. "I just had the sense to recognize it when everyone else was too blind." Grace had stirred in Mara's arms, making the small sounds that meant she'd wake soon and need feeding. Luke had reached over and gently stroked his daughter's soft cheek, marveling at the perfection of her tiny features. "She's going to be beautiful," he'd said. "She's going to be strong," Mara had corrected. "Beautiful is fine, but strong matters more. Strong means she'll survive whatever this world throws at her." "She'll be both," Luke had said, "just like her mother." As the sun had finally slipped below the mountains and the first stars had begun to appear in the darkening sky, Luke had felt a peace settle over him that he'd been chasing since the war ended. This was what he'd been fighting for, even when he hadn't known it. This moment, this family, this life. Not glory or honor or victory in any conventional sense, but simply the quiet joy of sitting on a porch with his wife and daughter, watching the day end and knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same. They'd gone inside as the night grew cold, Luke lighting lamps while Mara fed Grace and settled her for the night. And later, lying in bed with Mara's head on his chest and their daughter sleeping in the cradle Hugh had carved so lovingly, Luke had thought about the journey that had brought them here, from strangers bound by obligation to lovers bound by choice. From a marriage of convenience to a partnership that had transformed not just their lives, but their entire community's understanding of what marriage could be. "Thank you," he'd whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Mara had asked sleepily. "For saying yes. For giving us a chance. for being brave enough to love me even when it would have been easier not to. Loving you has never been hard, Mara had said. Everything else was hard. Loving you was the easiest thing I've ever done. And in that moment, lying in the house they'd built together with their daughter sleeping nearby and their future spreading out before them full of promise and possibility, Luke had understood that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as burdens, and sometimes the thing you think will break you ends up being exactly what saves you. He'd married Mara to settle a debt, but she'd given him something priceless in return, a reason to live, a future to build, and a love that had transformed them both from broken, lonely people into something whole and strong and beautiful. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and star-filled, and inside their home, a family born from obligation had become bound by the strongest force in the universe. Love freely given, freely received, and powerful enough to change the world. The years that followed Grace's birth passed with the peculiar speed that comes when life is full and rich and demanding. Luke would later reflect that time moved differently when you were happy, stretching out the precious moments while somehow also rushing past in a blur of days that became weeks, that became seasons, that became years before you could catch your breath. Grace had grown into a child who possessed her mother's fierce determination and her father's quiet strength, a combination that both delighted and occasionally terrified her parents. By the time she was 3 years old, she was already following her grandfather to the forge, watching with wide eyes as he shaped metal, asking endless questions about why fire was hot and how hammers worked and whether she could try. "She's got the gift," Hugh had said one afternoon, watching Grace toddle around the forge under her mother's watchful eye. Same as her mama. You can see it in how she watches the metal, how she understands that it's alive in its own way. Mara had returned to work at the forge when Grace was 6 months old, bringing the baby with her and working while Grace slept in a specially made cradle near the workbench. The town had initially been scandalized. What kind of mother brought an infant to a forge with all its heat and noise and danger? But Mara had been unmoved by their criticism. "My mother brought me to the forge when I was a baby," she'd told Luke. "I grew up breathing in iron dust and learning the rhythm of hammer on anvil. It didn't hurt me. If anything, it made me who I am." Luke had supported her decision completely, though he'd insisted on building safety barriers around the work areas and making sure someone was always watching Grace when Mara was actively working. The arrangement had worked better than anyone expected, with Grace seeming to find the sounds of the forge soothing rather than frightening, often sleeping more peacefully there than she did in the quiet of their home. The business had continued to grow and prosper. Word had spread throughout the territory about the quality of work coming from the Langley Forge, and customers had traveled from as far as Billings and Great Falls to commission custom pieces. Mara had developed a reputation for decorative ironwork that was both beautiful and functional, creating pieces that wealthy ranchers displayed with pride. Luke had been promoted to ranch manager at the Triple Bar after Thomas Garrett's previous manager had retired, a position that came with increased responsibilities and better pay. The extra money had allowed them to expand their own small herd of cattle and invest in improvements to their property, slowly building the foundation of what they hoped would one day be a ranch of their own. They'd had 2 more children in the years that followed Grace's birth. James had come when Grace was 2, a sturdy boy with Luke's gray eyes and serious demeanor, followed 3 years later by Eleanor, a laughing baby with Mara's dark hair and fierce spirit. The house that had seemed so spacious when they'd first built it had become comfortably crowded, filled with the chaos and joy of 3 children growing up wild and loved in the Montana mountains. Hugh had gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the forge, as arthritis had claimed his hands and age had stolen his stamina. He'd spent more time teaching than working, passing on decades of accumulated knowledge not just to Mara, but to a handful of young apprentices they'd taken on, both boys and girls, because Mara had insisted that skill had no gender, and she wouldn't perpetuate the limitations that had been placed on her. "You're changing the world," Luke had told her one evening as they'd watched one of her female apprentices, a girl named Sarah, successfully complete her first solo project. "One apprentice at a time, you're changing how people think about what's possible." "I'm just teaching people who want to learn," Mara had protested, but Luke had seen the pride in her eyes, the satisfaction of knowing she was creating opportunities for others that she'd had to fight so hard to claim for herself. The town had changed too, slowly but undeniably. The trial of Dr. Morrison and his co-conspirators had become a turning point, forcing Cottonwood Springs to confront its own prejudices and decide what kind of community it wanted to be. Some of the older generation had never truly accepted the changes, continuing to grumble about the decay of traditional values and the unnatural order of things. But the younger generation had embraced the new possibilities, with several young women pursuing trades or business ventures that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Billy Patterson had married Sarah Jenkins, and they'd opened a music school together, with Billy teaching woodworking and Sarah teaching piano. Young Tom Wilson had shocked everyone by becoming a teacher rather than following his father into ranching, claiming that Luke McAllister had shown him that a man's worth wasn't measured by how closely he conformed to expectations, but by how honestly he lived his own truth.